My name is Emily Carter, and for as long as I could remember, my father had only one way of introducing me. This is my biggest disappointment. It never mattered where we were. Family gatherings, neighborhood barbecues, holiday dinners, or church events, it was always the same. Sometimes people laughed because they thought he was joking. Others looked at me with uncomfortable sympathy before quickly changing the subject. I learned to smile. I learned to pretend it didn't hurt. But every word stayed with me. My younger sister, Olivia, was everything my father wanted. She graduated at the top of her class, became a successful corporate lawyer before turning 30, and had a fiancé whose family owned one of the largest construction companies in Virginia. To everyone else, we looked like the perfect American family. Inside our home, we couldn't have been more different. My father had once dreamed of becoming an army officer. He never made it past basic training because of a serious knee injury. Instead, he spent 30 years working as an accountant, always wondering what his life could have been. Perhaps that was why he expected perfection. Perhaps that was why failure was something he could never forgive, especially in me. When I was 18, I refused the law school scholarship he had spent years bragging about. Instead, I enlisted in the United States Army. My father didn't speak to me for almost 4 months. "You've thrown your future away," he had shouted the night before I left. No respectable woman chooses that life. My mother cried quietly in the kitchen while I packed my duffel bag. She wanted to stop me, but she knew she couldn't, because for the first time in my life, I had made a decision that belonged only to me. Basic training was harder than anything I had imagined. The days began before sunrise. The instructors showed no mercy. Every muscle in my body ached. More than once, I wondered if my father had been right. Maybe I wasn't strong enough. Maybe I really was the family failure. Then something happened during the 3rd week. One of the recruits collapsed during a night exercise. Everyone froze. Without thinking, I ran toward him, checked his breathing, stabilized his neck exactly as we had practiced, and called for the medic team. Later that night, my commanding officer pulled me aside. "You stayed calm when everyone else panicked." Those words stayed with me longer than any medal ever could, because no one had ever called me dependable before. Years passed. Training became deployments. Deployments became leadership responsibilities. I served in disaster relief operations, evacuation missions, and humanitarian assignments in countries most Americans had only seen on television. Some missions could never be discussed. Others were simply forgotten after the news cameras disappeared. That never bothered me. I hadn't joined for recognition. I joined because helping people gave my life meaning. Still, every time I came home on leave, nothing had changed. "So," my father would ask at dinner, "when are you finally getting a real career?" Olivia would glance at me with pity. Mom would quietly change the subject, and I would finish my meal in silence. Eventually, I stopped arguing. You can't convince someone to value a life they already decided wasn't worth respecting. 2 months before everything changed, I received orders assigning me to a humanitarian coordination task force working alongside several senior military leaders. It wasn't glamorous. Mostly paperwork, planning, emergency logistics. But it placed me in rooms with officers whose names appeared in military history books. One of them was General Samuel Harrison, a 4-star general respected across the entire Army. Despite his rank, he treated everyone with kindness. He remembered names. He thanked junior soldiers personally. He listened far more than he spoke. One afternoon, after a 16-hour emergency planning session following a hurricane response operation, I stayed behind organizing reports. The general noticed. "You've been here since dawn, Lieutenant Carter." "It's my responsibility, sir." He smiled.
No.
"It's your character." At the time, I didn't understand why those words mattered. A few weeks later, I would. Then came the invitation. My parents were celebrating their 35th wedding anniversary. Olivia insisted on hosting an elegant dinner at one of the finest country clubs in Richmond. Nearly 80 guests accepted. Business executives, judges,
Doctors.
politicians, family friends. My father couldn't stop talking about the guest list. When he called me, his voice sounded almost reluctant. "You should come. I waited. Then he added exactly what I expected. Just don't wear your uniform. I looked out the apartment window before answering.
Why?
It'll make people uncomfortable. I closed my eyes. After 10 years of service, after countless missions, after sacrificing birthdays, holidays, and relationships, my own father still believed my uniform was something to hide. I'll think about it, I replied. The evening of the anniversary arrived. I stood in front of my closet for nearly 20 minutes. Civilian dress. Or uniform. Finally, I reached for the dress uniform. Not to prove anything. Not to impress anyone. But because I had finally become proud of the woman staring back at me in the mirror. When I entered the ballroom, conversations paused for only a second before continuing. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. Soft piano music filled the air. Waiters carried silver trays between beautifully decorated tables. Everything looked perfect. My mother hugged me immediately. You look beautiful. Before I could answer, my father walked over. His smile disappeared the moment he saw the uniform. I told you not to wear that. I came as myself. He sighed loudly. Please don't embarrass this family tonight. Those words hurt. More than I expected. I simply nodded and walked toward the back of the room. A few minutes later, everyone took their seats. My father stood to welcome the guests. He proudly introduced Olivia. He praised her fiancé. He thanked every important visitor by name.
Then
He looked directly at me. And that's Emily. He forced a laugh. Our family disappointment. Several guests chuckled awkwardly. Someone lowered their eyes. Someone else looked away. I felt every heartbeat echo inside my chest. But I stayed silent.
Then
The ballroom doors slowly opened. An army aide stepped inside. Behind him, a tall man wearing 4 stars on his shoulders entered the room. General Samuel Harrison. The moment his eyes met mine, he stopped walking. For a moment, nobody moved. The sound of quiet conversations disappeared, replaced by complete silence. Even the waiters carrying silver trays stopped where they were, uncertain whether to continue serving or step aside. My father immediately straightened his suit jacket and hurried toward the entrance with a wide smile. General Harrison, he said enthusiastically, extending his hand. What an incredible honor. Thank you for accepting our invitation. The general acknowledged him with a polite nod, but he didn't shake his hand. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on me. I felt my stomach tighten. Had something gone wrong at headquarters? Was there an emergency? Had I forgotten to submit an important report? Before I could think any further, General Harrison began walking across the ballroom. Not toward the head table. Not toward my parents.
toward me.
Every guest instinctively turned to follow him with their eyes. His footsteps echoed across the polished marble floor. When he stopped in front of me, I immediately stood up. Good evening, sir. Before I could say another word, the general raised his right hand in a flawless military salute. I've been looking forward to seeing you again, Lieutenant Carter. The room froze. I returned the salute immediately. It's an honor to see you, sir. Only after lowering his hand did the general smile. The honor is mine. A wave of whispers spread through the ballroom. People looked from me to the general and back again. My father stared in disbelief. I'm sorry, he interrupted nervously. General, I believe you've mistaken my daughter for someone else. General Harrison slowly turned toward him. No. His voice remained calm. I never forget the people who earn my respect. Those words landed like thunder. For years I had heard my father describe me as a disappointment. Now the highest-ranking officer in the room was speaking about respect. The contrast couldn't have been greater. My father forced an uneasy laugh. Emily mostly handles routine work. She's always been, well, ordinary. I wished he would stop talking. Instead, he continued. We're much prouder of our younger daughter. She's the successful one. Olivia looked uncomfortable. For once, she didn't smile. General Harrison studied my father for several seconds before answering. Success is measured differently in the military. Then he looked back at me. I hope you don't mind if I borrow your daughter for a few moments. Borrow me? I was just as surprised as everyone else. Of course, my father answered quickly. The general led me toward one side of the ballroom, where the large windows overlooked the gardens. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he smiled. I owe you an apology. I blinked. Sir? I intended to arrive earlier, but my flight was delayed. I laughed softly. You don't have to apologize to me. Perhaps not. He folded his hands behind his back. But I walked in just in time to hear how your own family introduced you. His expression became serious. I didn't like it. I lowered my eyes. I'm used to it. That concerns me even more. For a few seconds we simply stood there, watching the fountain outside. Then he asked quietly, have you ever told them about the evacuation mission in Kyrgyzstan? No, sir. Or the flood rescue? No. The embassy incident? I shook my head again. Those missions weren't about recognition. They were about doing my job. The general nodded slowly. Exactly the answer I expected. Across the room, I could see dozens of curious faces watching us. Nobody could hear our conversation, but everyone wanted to know why a four-star general seemed more interested in speaking with a young lieutenant than with the city's most influential guests. The general noticed their curiosity. I think it's time people learn something about you. I immediately answered, Sir, I'd rather not. He smiled kindly, still protecting everyone else. Even now. Before I could respond, the master of ceremonies announced dinner. Everyone returned to their seats. To my complete surprise, General Harrison ignored the reserved seat beside my father. Instead, he pulled out the chair beside mine. The whispers grew louder. My father looked completely confused. Throughout the first course, several guests attempted to start conversations with the general. He answered politely, but his attention repeatedly returned to me. We spoke about soldiers we both knew, recent humanitarian operations, and the families displaced by natural disasters. There was no discussion of medals. No discussion of promotions. Only people. Across the table, my father watched every word. Finally, he couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. General Harrison, he said, forgive my question, but how exactly do you know Emily? The room became quiet again. The general carefully placed his fork on the plate. I first noticed Lieutenant Carter during a humanitarian command exercise. He looked around the table. Most people believe leadership is demonstrated when cameras are present. He smiled slightly. I've learned the opposite. Then, he continued. Everyone had been working nearly 18 hours without rest. Most officers focused on reports, presentations, and deadlines. He glanced toward me. But while everyone else hurried past, Lieutenant Carter noticed a frightened little girl sitting alone outside the emergency shelter. I remembered that day instantly. The child had become separated from her parents after severe flooding. She hadn't spoken for hours. General Harrison continued. Lieutenant Carter canceled her own meal break. She sat beside that little girl for almost 2 hours. No photographers. No reporters. No recognition. She simply stayed until the child finally smiled. Several guests quietly lowered their heads. The general wasn't finished. That little girl's parents were eventually located. When they were reunited, I watched Lieutenant Carter quietly walk away before anyone could thank her. The ballroom remained silent. My father shifted uneasily in his chair. It was just kindness, I said softly. General Harrison looked directly at me. No, it was character. And character cannot be taught. His words hung in the air. For the first time in years, I saw uncertainty on my father's face. Not anger, not disappointment. Uncertainty. As dinner continued, I noticed something else. Olivia hadn't spoken a single word. Instead, she kept watching me with an expression I couldn't understand. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't embarrassment. It looked more like regret. Then, just as dessert was being served, General Harrison stood. He picked up his glass. I'd like to make a brief toast. Every conversation stopped. No one in that ballroom realized that the next few minutes would change everything my family believed about me. General Harrison lifted his glass, but instead of speaking immediately, he looked around the ballroom as if making eye contact with every single guest. The room became so quiet that the soft music from the piano in the corner seemed unusually loud. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I've attended hundreds of formal dinners throughout my career. I've been welcomed by presidents, governors, ambassadors, and military leaders. He paused for a moment. But tonight, I witnessed something that deeply saddened me. Nobody moved. My father's smile slowly disappeared. When I entered this room, the general continued, I heard Lieutenant Emily Carter introduced as the family's disappointment. His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. I've spent more than 35 years leading soldiers. I've learned that titles can be impressive. Wealth can be impressive. Education can be impressive. But none of those things matter when lives are at stake. He turned toward me. In those moments, the only thing that matters is character. A few guests quietly nodded. The general continued. I've had the privilege of watching Lieutenant Carter serve under extraordinary pressure. She never sought recognition. She never asked for promotion. She never once tried to make herself the center of attention. Instead, she chose the harder path. He looked across the room again, serving others. I felt every eye in the ballroom fixed on me. Part of me wanted to disappear. The general smiled gently. Most of you probably believe heroes wear medals. He shook his head. Sometimes they wear muddy boots. A few people smiled. Then his expression became serious again. 3 years ago, during a humanitarian operation overseas, a school building collapsed after a powerful earthquake. The room fell completely silent. There were aftershocks every few minutes. Rescue teams had been ordered to stay back until engineers declared the structure safe. He looked directly at me, but before anyone could stop her, Lieutenant Carter heard children crying beneath the rubble. My breathing became heavier. I remembered every second.
The dust.
The screams. The smell of broken concrete. The fear. General Harrison continued. Against every instinct for self-preservation, she crawled into that unstable building. No cameras. No reporters. No audience. Just one soldier trying to save strangers. Several guests covered their mouths. The general continued quietly. For nearly 40 minutes, she remained inside. When she finally emerged, she wasn't alone. He raised one finger. One child. Then another. 2. Another. 3. Another. And finally, 4. He lowered his hand. 4 frightened children who are alive today because one young lieutenant refused to walk away. The ballroom remained frozen. No one spoke. No one even reached for their food. My father stared at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. I lowered my eyes. It wasn't only me, sir, I said softly. There were many others. General Harrison smiled. Exactly. That's why you deserve recognition. You never take all the credit. A quiet murmur spread through the guests. One elderly veteran slowly stood from his chair. He placed his hand over his heart. Without saying a word,
He saluted me.
then another veteran stood. He saluted too. Within seconds, 3 retired service members in the room were standing in silence. I quickly stood and returned every salute, feeling tears begin to form in my eyes. I had never expected this. Not here. Not in front of my family. The general waited until everyone was seated again. I haven't finished. His words immediately captured everyone's attention once more. There is another reason Lieutenant Carter has my deepest respect. He reached into the inside pocket of his dress jacket. My heart skipped. I knew what he was holding before he even removed it. A small leather notebook.
Mine.
It had been misplaced months earlier during a joint training exercise. I had assumed it was lost forever. The general held it carefully. I found this after an inspection. I intended to return it personally. He looked toward the guests. I made one mistake. I read one page. He smiled apologetically. I normally wouldn't, but I'm grateful I did. He opened the notebook. I won't read everything. Only one sentence. He adjusted his glasses. Then read aloud. If nobody remembers my name, I hope someone remembers how safe they felt when I was there. Silence. Absolute silence. Several guests wiped away tears. My mother quietly covered her face with one hand. The general closed the notebook. I've met officers who dream of becoming famous. I've met politicians who dream of becoming powerful. I've met executives who dream of becoming wealthy. But this young woman, he looked directly at me, dreamed only of making people feel safe.
His voice softened.
In my experience, those are the people who change the world. I couldn't hold back my emotions anymore. A tear rolled down my cheek. Across the table, my father looked completely broken. For the first time in my entire life, he had nothing to say. No one touched their dessert. The ballroom, which had been filled with laughter only an hour earlier, now sat in complete silence. Every guest seemed to be replaying the general's words in their mind. My father slowly lowered his eyes. For the first time in my life, I saw guilt replace pride on his face. General Harrison remained standing. "I have one final story to share," he said. "It's a story very few people know." I immediately looked at him. "Sir." He smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, Lieutenant. Nothing classified." The guests leaned forward, eager to hear more. "Last winter," the general began, "our task force was coordinating emergency relief after one of the worst snowstorms in recent history. Hundreds of families were trapped. Power lines had collapsed. Roads were completely blocked. Our command center had been working nonstop for nearly 48 hours. He paused before continuing. Everyone was exhausted. I ordered my officers to rotate shifts and get some sleep.
He looked at me.
Everyone obeyed. Everyone, except Lieutenant Carter. A few guests smiled. I found her sitting alone at 3 o'clock in the morning. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't drinking coffee. She wasn't complaining. She was making phone calls. The general's voice softened. Not to senior officers. Not to politicians. She was calling elderly residents who lived alone. Several people exchanged surprised looks. She had created her own list. One by one, she called every person she believed might be stranded. If someone answered, she stayed on the phone until rescue teams arrived. If nobody answered, she immediately marked the address as high priority. He looked around the room. That night alone, more than 20 senior citizens were rescued. The guests stared at me in disbelief. I felt uncomfortable. "It wasn't only my idea, sir," I said quietly. "The local volunteers helped." General Harrison smiled. "There you go again. Always sharing the credit." The room filled with gentle applause. At first it was only a few people. Then more joined. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was applauding. I stood frozen. Not because I enjoyed the attention, because I had spent my entire life believing I didn't deserve it. When the applause finally ended, my mother slowly stood. Tears streamed down her face. She walked across the room until she was standing in front of me. Without saying a word, she wrapped her arms around me. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have defended you years ago." I hugged her tightly. "You don't have to apologize, Mom." "Yes," she said through tears. "I do. I watched you carry this family on your shoulders while we kept pretending you weren't enough." Her words broke something inside me. Not in pain, in relief. For years I had convinced myself that nobody noticed. Now I realized someone always had. Across the room, Olivia slowly approached. She looked nervous. "I owe you an apology too." I looked at my younger sister. "You were never the problem." She shook her head.
"No."
"I let Dad compare us. I liked being the favorite. I never realized how much it hurt you." She wiped away her tears. "I was wrong." I smiled gently. "We were both trying to make him proud." She nodded, then hugged me. The applause returned. Only one person remained seated. My father. His hands rested on the table. His eyes never left the floor. General Harrison quietly walked over to him. "You look troubled." My father let out a long breath. "I spent 30 years believing success meant prestige. The best schools. The best career. The highest salary." He looked toward me. "I never once asked my own daughter what kind of person she wanted to become." His voice cracked. "I only cared about appearances." The general nodded. "Many people make that mistake. But very few admit it." My father slowly stood. Every guest watched him. He walked toward me one careful step at a time. Each step seemed heavier than the last. When he finally stopped in front of me, his hands trembled. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." I didn't answer. "I called you a failure. In front of strangers. In front of family. For years." He swallowed hard. "And all that time, you were becoming someone I could never become." Tears rolled down his face. "I'm ashamed of myself." The ballroom was completely silent. "I missed birthdays," he continued. "I ignored your letters. I never asked about your missions. I never once told you. I'm proud of you." His voice broke completely. "I'm sorry, Emily. I am so sorry. For years I had imagined this moment. I thought I would feel angry, victorious, satisfied. Instead, I only felt sadness. Not because of what he had done, because of how many years we had both lost." I stepped forward and hugged him. He immediately broke down in tears. "I'm proud to be your daughter," I whispered. "But I always wished you were proud to be my father." He held me tighter. "I am now. I always will be." Around us, many guests wiped away tears. Even the waiters had stopped working to watch. General Harrison smiled quietly. Not because someone had won, but because a family had finally begun to heal. For several long moments, no one spoke. My father and I remained standing in the center of the ballroom, holding each other in an embrace neither of us had imagined would ever happen. When we finally stepped back, I noticed something I hadn't seen in years. The hardness in my father's eyes was gone. For decades, he had carried himself like a man who believed he always had to be right. Tonight, that certainty had disappeared, replaced by humility. General Harrison walked toward us with a warm smile. "Mr. Carter," he said, "may I tell you one more thing about your daughter?" My father nodded immediately. "Please." The general looked around the room before speaking. "People often think courage means running toward danger." He paused. "But that's only part of the story. The greatest courage I've ever witnessed is choosing kindness after being treated unfairly." He turned toward me. "Lieutenant Carter has had countless opportunities to complain about her life. She never has. She has never blamed her family. She has never spoken with bitterness. Not once." I lowered my eyes. "I simply believed everyone was doing their best, sir." The general smiled. "And that is exactly why you earn my respect." He reached into his jacket one final time and removed a small navy blue presentation box. The room became silent again. "I had hoped to present this at headquarters next month." He looked directly at me. "But after what I witnessed tonight, I believe everyone here should see it." He opened the box. Inside rested a beautifully crafted medal. Its silver and bronze surfaces reflected the chandelier lights across the ballroom. Gasps echoed through the room. General Harrison carefully lifted the medal. "Lieutenant Emily Carter. In recognition of exceptional leadership, extraordinary compassion, and selfless service beyond the call of duty. It is my honor to inform you that your recommendation for the Army Distinguished Public Service Recognition has been officially approved." For a second, I couldn't breathe. I had known I had been nominated. I never expected to receive it. Certainly not like this. The general stepped forward and carefully placed the medal in my hands. The ballroom erupted into applause. People stood from every table. Some clapped. Some cried. Others simply smiled. My mother covered her mouth, overwhelmed with emotion. Olivia wiped tears from her cheeks while applauding harder than anyone else. My father didn't clap. He simply looked at me with eyes full of pride. Real pride. Not pride based on achievements. Not pride based on appearances. Pride born from finally understanding who his daughter truly was. When the applause faded, the general leaned closer and quietly said, "You've always believed this medal belonged to everyone who served beside you." I smiled. "It still does, sir." He laughed softly. "I knew you'd say that." One of the guests raised his hand. "General Harrison, may I ask something?" "Of course." "With officers this talented, how do you decide who deserves promotion?" The general answered without hesitation. "We don't promote people because they're perfect. We promote people because others become better when they're around. He looked at me. That's leadership. The guests nodded thoughtfully. A retired school principal stood and smiled. I've spent 40 years teaching children. If every student grew into someone like Lieutenant Carter, the world would be a far better place. More applause followed. As the evening slowly came to an end, people who had barely spoken to me before formed a line. Some wanted to shake my hand. Others wanted to thank me for my service. Several veterans shared stories from their own military careers. One elderly woman held both of my hands and smiled through tears. My husband served for 28 years. He passed away 5 years ago. He always said, "The best soldiers are the ones who never need recognition." She looked at the medal. "I think he would have been proud of you." I hugged her gently. "Thank you." Across the ballroom, I noticed my father quietly collecting the family photographs displayed near the entrance. One picture caught his attention. It showed Olivia graduating from law school. Another showed our family on vacation years earlier. Then he picked up an old photograph of me. I couldn't have been more than 8 years old. I was wearing a toy camouflage jacket and a bright smile. He stared at it for several seconds. When I walked over, he handed it to me. I remember this day. I smiled. "You bought me that jacket." He nodded slowly. "I had forgotten. You used to tell everyone you wanted to help people." I laughed softly. "I still do." He looked down again. "I spent so many years trying to change who you were. I forgot who you had always been." His words carried no excuses, only honesty. General Harrison joined us one last time before leaving. "Emily." "Yes, sir? I have a feeling this won't be the last time our paths cross." "I hope not, sir." He extended his hand. Instead of shaking it, I saluted. He immediately returned the salute. Every veteran in the room stood once again. One by one, they saluted too. It was a moment I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. Not because I had been honored, but because for the first time, my family finally saw me for who I truly was. The ballroom slowly began to empty. Guests gathered their coats, exchanged quiet goodbyes, and thanked my parents for the evening. But before leaving, nearly everyone stopped to shake my hand. The same people who had barely noticed me when I arrived were now smiling warmly, asking about my service, and thanking me for everything I had done. It felt strange, not because they respected me, but because I had never needed strangers' approval. The only approval I had wanted was my father's. And somehow, after all these years, I finally had it. As the last guests walked toward the exit, General Harrison prepared to leave. Before stepping outside, he turned back one final time. "Mr. Carter." My father immediately stood. "Yes, General?" The general smiled. "Take care of your daughter. People like her are rare." My father nodded without hesitation. "I will." "No." He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I'll do better than that. I'll make up for every year I lost." General Harrison smiled one last time. "I believe you will." With that, he saluted me. I returned the salute proudly. The general walked out of the ballroom, and as the doors quietly closed behind him, it felt as though an entire chapter of my life had ended. The drive home was unlike any we had ever shared. For years, silence between my father and me had been heavy and uncomfortable. Tonight, it felt peaceful. After several minutes, he finally spoke. "Emily, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why didn't you ever tell us about those missions?" I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. "Because I didn't do them for recognition. I did them because people needed help." He slowly nodded. "I spent my whole life chasing success. And you spent yours serving others." He sighed deeply. "I think you chose the better path." I smiled. "There isn't one definition of success, Dad. We just have different journeys." He looked at me. "I wish I had understood that years ago." "So do I." A few weeks later, life slowly returned to normal. At least, as normal as it could. I returned to my unit. Training continued. Meetings continued. Emergency planning continued. The world never stopped needing people willing to serve. One Monday morning, I was called into my commanding officer's office. He smiled the moment I entered. "Lieutenant Carter." At ease. I sat down. He handed me a folder. "I've received a personal recommendation from General Harrison." I looked at him in surprise. He rarely writes these. I carefully opened the folder. Inside was a single page. At the bottom was the general's signature. Near the top, one sentence immediately caught my attention. "Leadership is not measured by rank, but by the lives made better, because someone chose to care." I read it twice, then 3 times. It wasn't just a recommendation. It was a reminder of the kind of leader I wanted to become. Several months later, I received a promotion. When the ceremony was announced, there was one person I wasn't sure would come: my father. On the morning of the ceremony, I stood in formation with dozens of other officers. Families filled the auditorium. I scanned the audience. Then I saw him. Front row, wearing his best suit. Beside him sat my mother and Olivia. When our eyes met, he smiled. Not the proud smile he used to wear when talking about achievements. A quiet smile, the kind that comes from unconditional love. After the ceremony ended, he walked toward me carrying a small box. "I have something for you." I opened it carefully. Inside was the old toy camouflage jacket I had worn as a little girl. My mother laughed softly. "I've kept it all these years." Dad smiled. "I almost threw it away once." "I'm glad I didn't." He looked at the tiny jacket before looking back at me. I think that little girl became exactly who she dreamed of becoming. I couldn't stop smiling. "Thank you."
No.
He gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you for never giving up on yourself." Years passed. General Harrison eventually retired after an extraordinary military career. Before leaving service, he invited me to his retirement ceremony. During his farewell speech, he surprised everyone once again. He pointed toward me, sitting quietly among hundreds of officers. "If you want to know what the future of leadership looks like, it looks like Lieutenant Emily Carter." I felt embarrassed, but honored. After the ceremony, he handed me a small envelope. "Don't open it until I leave." Later that evening, I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. It read, "Emily, never let applause become your purpose, and never let criticism become your identity. The people who change the world are often underestimated at first. Keep serving. Keep caring. Stay exactly who you are." Samuel Harrison. I folded the letter carefully. Years later, I still carry it with me. Today, whenever young soldiers ask me for advice, I tell them one simple truth. Never let someone else's opinion decide your worth. Because titles fade. Money comes and goes. Recognition doesn't last forever. But kindness, integrity, courage, those things leave a legacy long after we're gone. As for my father, he never again introduced me as the family failure. Now, whenever someone asked about his daughter, he stood a little taller and smiled before saying, "This is my daughter, Emily. She taught me what success really means." And every single time he said it,
I realized something.
the greatest victory wasn't earning a medal. It wasn't receiving a salute from a 4-star general. It wasn't proving anyone wrong. The greatest victory was healing a family that had forgotten how to believe in one another.